Please be aware that this episode contains discussions of trauma and emotional distress. Please care for your well-being while listening.
Hello and welcome back to Frontline in our second episode discussing the world of vicarious trauma. My name is David Gill.
And I'm Andrew James.
And in this episode, we are delving beneath the surface and really thinking the impact this can have on people. So in the previous episode, we touched upon what vicarious trauma was, and we heard from a few people about how it started to impact them. And the idea of this episode is we're going to go in a little bit more depth, really think about what that does to a person, both in your professional world, but also in your home world as well. And perhaps think a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes within the brain. So with this episode being a little bit more about that deeper dive, really thinking about the impacts, what's this mean to you then? What's this understanding about going a bit deeper within this then?
Well, when I'm trying to picture or explain, I guess, impacts of vicarious trauma, and this hopefully doesn't sound too reductive, but it's a simile that I've used. That's not a simile, is it? It's a metaphor I've used that is helped me kind of visualize things. I always tried to explain it as a sponge, like your brain is a sponge, or your emotional ability to manage is like a sponge. And obviously, whenever you've had a sponge or used one, the first few droplets of water, the first few weeks, months, years of working, you'll barely see. They'll soak up really easily, really readily. You barely tell after a little bit of time that there was ever any water there. But it's the accumulative effect. It's the over time processing of so much in there, ultimately then renders the sponge unusable. And they have the choices of having to deal with things, wring it out, let things go, deal with it in a proper way, or be left with something that is effectively rendered unusable or not usable and not fit for purpose at that time.
It's a really good way of putting it. And I think a lot of people talk about that example, and I think which is great, absolutely great. But I think what a lot of people don't really do is understand that they are the sponge. They look at it in almost an abstract way, going, yeah, I get it. And maybe I see it in some of my colleagues or in other people. And I think it sometimes can be quite difficult for people to realize that sponge isn't other people, it's you. Everyone is going to be affected by this at some point. And I guess one of the most powerful things that vicarious trauma can do is convince you that you don't have it. It can convince you that you're absolutely fine. And like you say, even though your sponge is full and you're dragging it along and struggling with it, you are still walking around, smiling away, going, I am absolutely fine. And I even use that a lot with the services I support and talk about how we've normalized the I'm fine culture, and about how in day-to-day life, for example, we just walk down the street, we see someone we half know, say, all right, how are you? We use it as a sort of a basic question we expect. Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How are you? We've normalized that I'm fine or how are you should only require a really basic answer. But if you ask someone how are you and they genuinely tell you, it can throw you off a little bit because you're like, I wasn't expecting that. You've just wringed out your sponge in front of me and I've suddenly absorbed this as well. So when we're talking about vicarious trauma, being aware of it is one thing, but really understanding what goes on below the surface and to think about this impact will lead us into our next episode about how we then start to respond to this. But I'm a firm believer that you can only really respond to this when you are honest with what some of the impacts are for both yourself and the people around you, your colleagues, or if you manage the staff that you support.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And it was, while you were talking about that, I was thinking about another analogy, which is probably less nice, which is the analogy of, placing the frog in the cold water and put the heat on rather than put it in the boiling water. It doesn't realize the water's heating up until it's too late. I think that is the one that we can visualize the sponge for other people, but we're very much the frog, not realizing what's going on around us.
Yes, and the as we'll talk about in this episode, that this concept of emotional blunting is also dangerous, because what part of that belief that the water is not boiling is this emotional blunting that is occurring, this belief that I'm fine, and really what's happening for a lot of people is this: their emotions are switching off, not because we've become horrible human beings, but because our primitive brains are trying to protect us. They're trying to keep us safe. Our primitive brains think we're idiots, because, like, why on earth are you doing jobs like this where you are constantly absorbing other people's stories? Why are you doing this to yourself? Why are you doing this? We do it because we care, but our primitive brains don't always understand this. And if it thinks it's having this impact, it will do what it can to keep you safe, including put, like we say, this sort of blunting that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail.
Vicarious trauma often doesn't arrive with a bang. It's the slow, cumulative impact of carrying other people's pain. Day after day, story after story.
Clinically, it can manifest in many ways. Emotionally, people might feel detached, irritable, or helpless. Cognitively, there might be negative shifts in worldview, questioning people's safety, intentions, or justice itself.
Someone will share their experiences with you, will take it on board. That might have an instant physical thing. You might notice that your heart starts to race. You might start to feel stressed and physically uncomfortable.
This is Dr. Ian Caldwell, CEO of Let's Connect.
You're distressed, you don't want to be there as much. It might play on your mind, and you might start with your imagination, and it could happen in a nightmare. So it's not straightforward. I like this idea of what we call it cognitive subsystems. We've got all these different systems in place: physiology, our mental imagery, our emotional systems, our cognitive systems, our sound phonological system. All these systems are what the human body is made up of. But you might have a sensitivity in one area that will impact on the others. So these systems all interact with each other. The information is being processed constantly. And a lot of it's to do with meaning and value, what value you give this. So if you start to really, it's like, really process what's happened to someone and really connect them at a really deep level, that's going to have quite a profound effect on you. So it might have quite a huge, significant impact. And you'll know people who get really attached to the clients they're working with, bond at really, really deep level, a level at every boundary, every therapy model say don't do. But it's human. We do that, and then that can leave. It's like a child or a family member going through difficulties. You can really experience that and process that, as in you're deeply connected to that person. Switching that off is quite a hard thing to do. I mean, the metaphor is if someone's in a ditch and they're really distressed, and you get down when you're in the ditch and you're really distressed. Now we've got two distressed people, and you can feed each other. So now you're experiencing what the other person's experiencing. So in a way, that's what the difference between empathy and compassion. Compassion is, I understand where you are, and I need to get you out, and I need to protect myself while I'm getting you out. But I'm absolutely committed to changing your life. Empathy, sometimes it's the right thing to do, is I'm getting down with you. So you can be consumed. You might not be fully focused on the best interests of that person. It might take over your life. You might break boundaries. be highly distressed, and then you're depleted for the next people that you're going to see. And in a way, this does happen. People can be overly connected to one person away with and not the others, and maybe pull back. So you're not actually giving everyone the same type of service. You're wearing yourself down, and I think you can have your own emotional difficulties, and it can bring out, if you're not careful, of your own experiences, and that sometimes the reason why people do that as well. They can see that connection, they know what that person's been through, but actually it's not helping you, and maybe you're not the best version to help that person as well. And also, that person doesn't need you to be highly distressed. They didn't want you to be like that, but you do know some people who do that, and I've spoke to people who've been through this and thinking this person's not helpful anymore. They're really too distressed. I don't think they're in a good place to help me. And quite often, which is some of the research I quite like, is what is going through a person who's trying to access services for help actually have to disengage from people because they're not helpful. Because they become troublesome, but we're not able to have them genuine open conversations because of boundaries and other things. I think it can be very difficult for people compromising.
Physically, symptoms include headaches, fatigue, insomnia, or even digestive issues.
Some professionals report being overly protective of loved ones or suspicious of others. Others describe emotional numbing, a disconnection from joy, from friends, even from family.
This emotional blunting is common, and is not limited to clinical professionals. Youth workers, housing officers, outreach teams, even call centre staff. Anyone exposed to human suffering without proper support is at risk.
And you'd get like 6 free sort of therapy sessions. Now, although it's very useful for a lot of people, it's not really tailored to the work that we're doing, if that makes sense. It's a very generic sort of, okay, have you tried a relaxing bath and counting from 1 to 10? No, I needed a bit more than that, you know. And as well, when you're working with, especially as a young girl coming into an established staff team with, you know, middle-aged women that have been there for, you know, years, it's you feel weak. You feel weak.
This is India Ellis, who has worked in challenging behaviour units and psychiatric wards.
And yeah, that's what it definitely was for me. But then I also know other people that was more open about it, and again, they didn't really get the support. For me, because I enjoyed so much, it then sort of turned into this numbness. So like a client could tell me the worst story you'd ever hear in your life, and you won't batter an eyelid because you feel like you've heard it all before, you know, and nothing shocks you. Although you feel them intense feelings aren't there as much anymore, and you start to become cynical then. And on my days off back then, all I would do is just simply sleep, recover, and then go back at it again. And like I said, you know, I thought it was a me problem. I thought I wasn't cut out for the role, and I used to ask myself, why do I feel so anxious? Why do I have that sicky feeling? You know, going back to that client or even going to that environment at all, even though I was so passionate of this is what I wanted to do for so long.
These changes can also show up in team dynamics, avoidance, short tempers, even high turnover. And sadly, all too often, these symptoms are mistaken for poor performance rather than seen as signs of vicarious trauma.
A 2020 study by the Royal College of Nursing found that while 60% of nurses reported signs of chronic stress, only 30% had regular access to reflective supervision. The gap between exposure and support is still far too wide.
I have to remind myself, this is not yours. You know, it belongs to somebody else.
This is Anita Hemmings, who works with young adults.
And you need to put it away in another box. That's how I have to try and deal with it. But it's not easy. It takes its toll. it's very, very, very exhausting, because you're trying to be there to support, whether it's the clients, whether it's the staff. I'm there to support. I've always done that for the majority of my life. But I think all of that now is taking its toll. So if I'm feeling on a low, especially like I was yesterday, I don't know, I've never felt such anger, rage, because I was just so et up with everything. So I thought, right, you're on your way home. That's fine. I'm going to be on my own. No one's going to be bothering me. So I got in. Unfortunately, I had to still go on the laptop, do a couple of things. And then after I cut off, put my music on. So that's the kind of way I deal with it.
Although vicarious trauma hits us in our work, it doesn't stay there. This can have a profound effect on you out of your role. Partners, children, family and friends often notice a difference in people suffering from vicarious trauma. You can seem like a different person, or perhaps have a deep emotional shift in your core values. This can then compound the issue on the person suffering vicarious trauma, as they can push those closest to them away, or keep emotional distance to keep themselves safe.
There was a turnover of staff, but so I kind of knew there was a shelf life for the job when I started. I wasn't naive to that. And, when I started with it, I thought, yeah, I'll do 2 years and then see what else comes up in the organisation and see where else it'll take me.
This is Dave Wall, a former drug and alcohol support worker.
But I got a year in, I thought, there's no way I'm doing 2 years. And that was after a year. I've become very hardened to it in that time. There was a situation where I'd requested some flexible working, and it wasn't that much for a request. It was like alternate weeks of 8 till 4 and 9 to 5, because I felt between 8 and 9 I could get a ton of admin stuff done and be ready to face the day. Realistically, we had very few clients coming after 4, so it really didn't affect the face-to-face service stuff. So I got refused with no real reason behind it. A couple of other colleagues leave or get transferred to other teams, so the experience in the team has evaporated. So, I'm like thinking, well, I don't want to be the person who takes on all the really tough cases. So, although I knew there was a kind of lifespan to the job, and I thought it'd be over 2 years, within a year, that was like my cut-off point, and I started looking elsewhere.
Those closest to you might not understand this change and wonder why the person they love seems to have changed so profoundly.
Recognizing these effects is the first step to responding to vicarious trauma. However, an effective response needs to involve our colleagues, managers, and our wider organisation in order to be effective.
In a lot of services, funding there's not a lot of it. So they're not going to spend it on staff wellbeing because, it's not a priority. And I don't think people do it on purpose. I just think that there is other things that they need to spend the funding on.
This is Amanda Chalmers, a trauma-informed consultant from Be Informed.
And, when you think about what the statistics are and what they're needed for, staff wellbeing's not on there. So if services and organisations are wanting to hit certain statistics, certain goals, certain figures for the greater good, normally for government, then unfortunately staff wellbeing isn't on there. So, it's something that they'll manage sickness, they won't prevent, they will manage it. And it just depends how well they manage that, whether that is managed in a really compassionate way or whether it's quite heavy-handed.
This is Richie Andrew from Every Man Can.
I think the first thing I'd say is at a micro level, is at an individual level. It's something that almost all of us at some point will experience. Like, it's basically exposure to something that's emotionally tough to hear, shall we say, or to observe even, and then having to figure out exactly what's going on in terms of our response to that, and then find out what works for us in terms of coping with it and finding an outlet for that. That people almost need to be able to have it reflected back to them when they're experiencing it. So if they don't see it and it builds up, and obviously that can be catastrophic in some cases, where people don't recognize what's going on. Yet at the same time, it's also an opportunity, isn't it? If it goes well and it's positively supported, that then people can see their own experience, understand their own limitations, understand their triggers, and then find what works for them in terms of releasing that and supporting themselves, basically. So putting themselves forward.
So, as we've seen in this episode, the impact of vicarious trauma is huge. And we touched upon this on episode 1. And this episode, we've delved even deeper to really think about what this does to us and how talking about this puts us in quite an emotionally poor place. But it's the first step of moving on from this, is from, I guess, finding your own resilience to vicarious trauma, is to be vulnerable, is to talk about this, is to open up about this. And in the world of vicarious trauma, it has been identified that there are increased risks. So if, for example, someone has themselves been through quite a difficult traumatic situation currently or in the past, you can be triggered. You can be triggered off by what you've been through because you suddenly deal with it head on. And if you haven't fully processed it, dealt with it in the past, you can then be in a really vulnerable position of reliving it as well. That doesn't mean that people with trauma histories, lived experience, shouldn't work in this field, but it should be something for us to be mindful of, and something absolutely we'll touch upon in future episodes as well. There is, for me, one of the biggest risks out there, added risk factors, which is when people are new into this line of work. If you haven't worked in a helping profession, supporting profession, just people in general, you can sometimes go into it with a bit of a superhero vibe about you. The cape comes on and you feel, right, I'm going to solve everything, fix everything. I will make sure that society is sorted and people are helped. And you put so much into this, even if people in your team are telling you, you might want to rein it in a little bit. You think, no, I know best. And usually what has to happen is that you can crash down a little bit before you sort of find your level. And for some people, that crash can be just a bit of burnout or just a bit of rejigging yourself. But for some, that initial drop can be quite a powerful vicarious trauma. And again, if you are not aware of what it is, what it does, you have that as your first sort of hurdle, your first negative experience, which will then colour and shape everything else you do in this world, which for me could be potentially dangerous. It's like anything. If you don't deal with something, it always has the habit of staying there in the background, ready to rear its head up again at some point in the future.
I think that's very true. I remember examples of when I first started in my working career in these fields. 2006. God, that's just aged me, hasn't it? Never mind. Let's cut that out. Yeah, maybe not. But I didn't work inside, but I was connected to drugs, alcohol fields, and it was often quite common with new starters there, as you say. I would go as far as to say the superhero thing, but you can absolutely see there is a there are brighter eyes, bushier tails, and a real desire to make meaningful differences, which is great because that's what we're here for at the end of the day. But I think, unfortunately, that also comes with a few disadvantages, especially the ones that come with experience, which is sometimes, unfortunately, if you're working with cohorts with illicit drug or alcohol issues, there can be difficulties with engagements, there can be difficulties with attendance, there can be occasionally issues with behaviour. It's just an unfortunate fact of the work that gets conducted in those fields. Sometimes that can happen. And especially with the engagement and attendance drops, I think you can tell sometimes people who are fresh to the roles aren't quite prepared for some of those challenges and how to properly address them or how to protect themselves when things don't go as they'd hoped, which unfortunately does happen.
Absolutely. And I think this is why our next episode, we are really going to be thinking about what we can do to respond to this. But I guess before we go any further into that next episode and thinking about it, one of the areas that we need to recognize is that a true response to this isn't an individual response. We can all care for ourselves. We can all help ourselves and our colleagues. But one of the things that we will look at in the next episode is how important wider organizational strategies, sort of wider approaches across the whole field, recognizing and responding to this is so vital. And I do occasionally come across some cynical senior managers who think that this is overplayed and over talked about. But even if you look at it from a business point of view, if this happens to your staff members, they are going to be burnt out. They are going to be on sick, leaving the job, or if they're in the job, they're not going to be that productive. And that is going to have a cost for how you operate your service and ultimately people you support. If you then don't build it into the culture, you will hire more staff who are not aware of this and you don't have safeguards in place. And this is one of the challenges that we're seeing at this minute, is this ongoing recruitment cycle that people are having. And I'm not saying talk about vicarious trauma will solve this, but it might be one of the pieces of the puzzle that can make a difference.
I think that's one of the unfortunate, I suppose, from frontline workers' perspectives, a grubbier aspect of these situations, that I guess it's finding out how to sell these things to the people with the purse strings, and often that does come down to the dollars and the cents. But there we are.
Exactly. Which I guess is exactly why we will be tackling that in our next episode. So I've been David Gill.
And I've been Andrew James.
And we'll be back for episode 3.